A 26-year-old former boxer and nightclub bouncer was stabbed to death 2 weeks ago. Friends from Tyneside joined mourners on Teesside for one of the biggest funerals seen in his hometown of Southbank.
He became a legend in the underworld among his friends and enemies. He'd refused police protection 3 times after alleged attempts on his life since last Christmas.
At 6'4" and weighing around 16 stones, he was inordinately proud of his physique and strength. By the age of 26, he'd already served 2 jail sentences for robbery and for serious assault in which a youth lost an eye. Duffy quickly became a leading figure by the simple expedient known as taxing, beating, robbing and intimidating drug pushers into working for him. It was not without its dangers.
He represents the end of an era in Middlesbrough, without a doubt. There are people who, since his death, have tried to emulate him and failed miserably, but none of them have ever caused as many problems for the community, for the underworld, as Lee Duffy has. And I don't think there ever will be another man of that stature and that power in the Cleveland area.
Middlesbrough, 1991. A town gripped by fear, where one man's name reverberated in every street fight and whispered warning: Lee Duffy. His reign of terror came to a bloody end, but the stories about him would become legend. He was one of the most infamous figures to emerge from the criminal underworld in the northeast of England. Known for his explosive temper, fearsome reputation, and violent confrontations, Duffy became a household name in Middlesbrough during the 1980s and early 90s. But what made him such a feared figure? And how did a man who seemed unstoppable meet his tragic end so young? In this video, we'll explore the rise and fall of Lee Duffy. From his beginnings as a street brawler to his time as a feared taxman in the drug world, we'll cover his violent confrontations, including his infamous rivalries with figures like Viv Graham and the circumstances that led to his untimely death. Stay tuned as we delve into the life and legacy of one of the most notorious figures in Teesside's criminal history. Lee Duffy, known to many as the Duffer, was born in June 1965 in Southbank, Middlesbrough. Southbank, also known as Slaggy Island, was one of the toughest areas in Middlesbrough at the time, and it was in this harsh environment that Lee's early life unfolded. Lee was the son of Brenda and Laurie Duffy. His mother, a hard-working woman, lived with his father, a heavy drinker, in Eston, raising their 4 children, Lorraine, Lee, Louise, and Laurie Jr. Before Laurie Sr., Brenda had 3 children from a previous marriage, but Lee's father refused to raise them, leading Brenda to give them up to their grandparents. As a child, Lee was not the fearsome figure he would later become. He was a chubby kid with a snotty nose, a distinctive arched walk, and a mop of big hair, which made him an easy target for bullies. From the age of 6 until around 12, he was severely bullied by older boys from Southbank, both in and out of school. The torment often left him running home in tears, feeling powerless against the abuse. Lee's father, frustrated by his son's tears and victimhood, began to teach him how to defend himself. Early mornings were spent at the boxing bag, where Laurie Sr. showed Lee how to throw punches, determined that his son would no longer be a bullied child who simply cried about it. His home life was tense and violent, largely due to his father's abusive behavior toward his mother. After heavy drinking, his father would often return in a rage, enforcing harsh discipline for minor issues. Lee frequently witnessed these incidents, which sometimes led to fights between his father and his uncle, who defended Brenda. Because of this, young Lee avoided home, choosing to roam the rough streets of Southbank late into the night to escape the chaos. For him, the streets were preferable to the turmoil that was waiting for him when he returned. At age 12, Lee met Marty Turner, a local boxing trainer, and found solace at the Grangetown Boxing Club. Determined to stop being a victim, he trained but never showed up for scheduled fights. The gym became his refuge for about a year. Even as Lee's reputation grew, he always respected Marty. By 13, Lee had transformed from a bullied child to a more assertive figure. He became confrontational, pushing to the front of lines at school and arguing with classmates. By 14, he started fighting, and by 15, his reputation for fighting and trouble was well known. He was no longer someone to be easily picked on, but someone to be feared. Despite his mother's efforts to keep him out of trouble, Lee was determined to forge his own path. He dabbled in odd jobs, but had bigger ambitions, aiming to build his own empire. Once a bullied kid, Lee had transformed into a figure of power and fear, shaped by the adversity he faced. His path soon led him to a familiar place for many who walked the same streets: jail. At just 17, he was imprisoned at Low Newton Remand Center in 1982 for burglary, where the harsh environment and interactions with hardened criminals made him confront the grim reality of his life choices. A pivotal encounter during this time was with Stephen Sayers, a fellow inmate from Newcastle. Their meeting would set off a chain of events that shaped Lee's trajectory in ways he could never have predicted. Although his stint in prison offered a moment of pause, it didn't steer him off the violent path he was carving out for himself. Once he got out, Lee quickly reverted to using his fists to solve problems, finding violence to be more effective than words. His aggressive tendencies led to another arrest, landing him a 6-month sentence not long after his release. By this time, Lee, now 16, had grown into a towering figure, standing at 6 feet 4 inches with a lean, muscular build. His physical presence alone was enough to intimidate most, and he was fast becoming known not just for his size, but for the raw aggression that accompanied it. One night, while waiting in line outside a nightclub on Newport Road, Lee's infamous temper flared. Milton Spanswick, known as Spanny, a former doorman with a reputation of his own, brazenly cut the line. Without hesitation, Spanny strolled past the entire queue, heading straight for the entrance. For most, Spanny's presence was enough to let him get away with it, but not for Lee. Lee immediately called him out, demanding that he get to the back of the queue. Spanny turned around, ready to confront Lee for challenging him, but before Spanny had a chance to react, Lee launched into action. A flurry of punches came from every angle, leaving Spanny overwhelmed and on the floor. For Lee, these altercations weren't just about showing physical strength, they were about something far more important: establishing respect. In the rough, gritty streets of Teesside, respect was a currency, and Lee was determined to collect it at any cost. Lee's friendship with Stephen Sayers, a well-respected figure in Newcastle's criminal underworld, played a significant role in elevating his status. As Lee's reputation grew, so did his desire to prove himself. Not every fight ended in victory, but Lee was relentless in his pursuit of respect. He sought out the toughest men, those known for their strength and fearlessness, to make his mark. They called him the Terminator, because if he lost, he always said he'll be back. By 18, in 1983, Lee's life wasn't just about street brawls anymore. It was also about the vibrant nightlife. He became a regular at clubs like Havana, where he wasn't just known for fighting, but was part of the social scene. It wasn't unusual to hear Lee on the mic, standing by the DJ booth, wearing just a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, becoming a recognizable figure in the club circuit. It was during this time that Lee crossed paths with Ray and Kevin Duckling, also known as Ducko, two highly respected figures in the Teesside underworld. Lee admired them, particularly Kevin, who was considered the top man at the time. The Ducklings, with their fearsome reputations, took Lee under their wing, imparting wisdom that would shape his approach to the criminal world. Lee looked up to them and absorbed everything they taught him as he climbed through the ranks of the underworld. His visits to pubs in Grangetown, a place tied to his past of bullying and hardship, became symbolic. No longer the scared boy who was once tormented, Lee returned to face his past, not just seeking any fight, but targeting the toughest challenges. He had no interest in fighting those he knew wouldn't stand a chance. He wanted to test himself against the best, to prove to those who once doubted him that he had become something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. In April 1983, Lee Duffy's violent tendencies erupted again. This time, it was in a Middlesbrough hotel where he assaulted and robbed a guest. The crime landed him back behind bars, sentenced to 30 months in prison by the end of the year. But prison wasn't enough to curb his appetite for trouble. In 1985, Duffy was released, and it didn't take long for him to fall back into his old ways. His life became a cycle of court appearances for fights and robberies. His fearsome reputation silenced witnesses, as few dared to testify against him, knowing the risks of violent retribution. His name was both feared and respected on Middlesbrough's streets. By the age of 19, Duffy's fighting style had become even more brutal and efficient. He didn't waste time. His goal in any fight was to end it quickly, delivering each blow with such force and aggression that his opponents were often unconscious before they even hit the ground. Drug dealers, in particular, feared encounters with Duffy. He had developed a reputation for taxing them, demanding money with the threat or reality of violence. By June 1986, as Duffy turned 21, his violent lifestyle showed no signs of slowing down. He was arrested again for fighting, but as had become common by then, the charges were dropped due to the lack of willing witnesses. Fear of retaliation kept people from coming forward, and Duffy's reign of terror continued. Later that year, during a stint in Durham prison, he befriended ex-heavyweight boxer Manny Burgo, and the two would go on to become close friends. Duffy's presence in pubs and clubs instantly changed the atmosphere, often leading to violence. In 1987, after being refused entry to a Newcastle club, he knocked out several bouncers, drawing the attention of Viv Graham, a feared local figure. When Graham warned him in a threatening phone call, Duffy's chilling response was, "Tell me where you are, and I'll come to you now," proving he wasn't intimidated by no one, and he didn't care who or what you were. Duffy's rise to infamy was swift and inevitable. From his early days, his prowess in bare-knuckle fighting became legendary across Middlesbrough and beyond. Challengers from neighboring areas often staked money, eager to test their strength against him in these brutal, high-stakes punch-ups. Despite stepping straight from nights of heavy partying, often with substances coursing through his veins, Duffy would emerge victorious. His dominance in these fights became a well-known fact, and few dared to challenge him. By this time, Lee had become a fixture at the infamous blues parties, where the region's toughest and most feared gathered. In these circles, everyone knew one thing: Lee Duffy didn't lose fights. Even with powerful allies, Duffy was unlike many in the criminal world. He often moved alone. He didn't rely on the safety of numbers and didn't shy away from his enemies. Wherever he went, he was ready for whatever came his way. As his reputation grew, he entered the drug trade, both supplying and robbing local dealers. His ruthless methods intimidated even the toughest in Teesside. After a fight with Brian Cockerell, another feared figure in Taxman in Newcastle, they formed an unexpected alliance, quickly dominating the criminal scene and taking whatever they wanted: drugs, money, or cars. Despite his reign of terror, Duffy's life was not without danger. He survived 3 direct attempts on his life, including shootings and a particularly terrifying incident where he was doused in petrol. His name alone struck fear into so many that taxi drivers, upon recognizing him, wouldn't even dare ask for their fare, knowing the consequences of angering him. His reputation was complex. Despite being born and raised in Teesside, he was feared and hated there, while in Tyneside, he was both feared and loved. He embodied a figure who inspired awe or terror depending on one's perspective. Some saw him as a hero, while others saw him as nothing more than a bully. His criminal activities would inevitably again catch up with him, landing him in Durham prison. In 1988, after a violent altercation at a Leeds versus Middlesbrough football tie, he was sentenced to 4 years behind bars, though he would serve 26 months. The incident that led to his sentence involved a brawl at the Speakeasy, where Duffy and his friend Vince Ager clashed with a group of men from Leeds. While Vince was arrested alongside Duffy, he kept quiet, and the police ultimately let him go. Martin Clark, a known figure from the Leeds firm, was left in such bad shape from the fight that he had to be hospitalized and ended up losing his eye. Even before his prison stint, Duffy's reputation by now was well established. He was known as a fearless fighter with devastating knockout power. If Lee hit you, you stayed hit. Inside Durham Nick, his presence was as commanding as it was on the outside. He earned both the caution of the guards and the respect of fellow inmates. The prison staff, often referred to as screws, did their best to avoid confrontation with Lee, fully aware he was not someone to take lightly. On one occasion, Duffy brazenly walked into the recreation room, asked a guard for a lighter, lit a joint, and blew smoke directly in the screw's face, an act of defiance that only added to his fearsome legend. During his time in Durham, Duffy shared the same prison as notorious prisoner Paul Sykes, who we've already featured on this channel, though their paths never really crossed. He also served time alongside Viv Graham, another feared figure from the Northeast mentioned earlier. The two alpha males inevitably clashed, each trying to prove who was the dominant force. However, Viv was released shortly before Duffy, allowing their rivalry to simmer without boiling over. When Lee was released from prison in May 1990, he soon fixated on Graham. While both were feared legends, Duffy's obsession with Viv turned into a personal vendetta. For the last 15 months of his life, Duffy frequently visited Newcastle by himself, constantly trying to provoke Viv Graham into a confrontation. Despite Duffy's relentless efforts, Graham, a now savvy businessman and devoted family man, wisely chose to keep his distance. No matter what Duffy tried, Graham refused to be drawn into a public showdown. This infuriated Duffy, as he was used to eliminating any competition that threatened his reputation. For him, Viv Graham represented the one rival he couldn't beat, simply because he couldn't get him to fight. In the last 2 years of Lee Duffy's life, he and Neil Booth became incredibly close. Neil was much like Duffy, tough, fearless, and always up for something dangerous, whether it was robbery, taxing drug dealers, or fighting. Neil was seen as a one-man army, but unlike Duffy, he was widely liked. Together, they formed a formidable duo, inseparable in both friendship and crime. Although some viewed Lee as a bully, he had a strong disdain for seeing others being mistreated, especially those who couldn't defend themselves. Despite his rough exterior, he had a code. He wouldn't attack kids or the vulnerable. His targets were always those who considered themselves tough. If you were hard, or thought you were, Duffy wanted to fight you. If you sold drugs in front of him, he would take everything you had. That was how he operated, intimidating, fearless, but with his own strange sense of moral justice. One example of this was when a local shop, Bobby Cycles, had bicycles stolen that were meant for underprivileged children. Upon hearing the news, Duffy demanded their immediate return. Within 24 hours, the bikes were back, untouched. It was one of those rare moments where his softer side peeked through. Neil Booth, Duffy's closest friend at the time, often found himself in trouble. One incident saw Neil getting into an altercation with a taxi driver over a fare, leading to blows being exchanged. The taxi driver, determined to keep Neil in the car, reversed up a narrow road, trapping him inside. He radioed for backup, summoning more taxi drivers and the police to the scene. Neil, never one to back down, smashed open the sunroof, climbed out, and onto a nearby building where he began throwing tiles down at the taxi drivers. The police arrived, but Neil, in typical fashion, told them to back off. The situation escalated, and knowing they needed someone to calm him down, the police went looking for Lee Duffy. Surprisingly, Duffy showed up with the police and began talking to Neil. After some heated words between the two, Neil eventually agreed to come down. As the police took Neil into custody, Duffy made it clear to the officers, "If anything happens to Neil, I'll hold you personally responsible." On December 27, 1990, the violence Duffy lived by finally turned against him in a chilling encounter outside Ramsey's Blues on Princess Road. A man approached the doorman, casually asking for Duffy under the guise of a friendly chat. As Duffy descended to meet him, the situation quickly escalated. Spotting the man's gun, Lee charged in a desperate attempt to neutralize the threat, but the assailant fired, shooting him through the knee. The attack led to the arrests of 3 men from Northumberland, Raymond Palmer, Robert Charlton, and Anthony Cole, who were all charged with attempted murder. However, the charges were later dropped. Despite the severity of the injury, Duffy's spirit remained unbroken. Even on crutches, he continued settling disputes with his fists, knocking opponents out cold, undeterred by his physical limitations. But 1991 brought no respite. In January, another violent incident unfolded at a blues party on Harrington Road. Duffy, along with his friends Vince Ager and Neil Booth, was enjoying the night when Booth briefly stepped out. During his absence, a large man armed with a shotgun stormed in. Duffy bravely grappled with the gunman, but in the struggle, he was blasted in the foot. Despite bleeding heavily, he managed to escape and meet Booth up the road, where police soon arrived and rushed him to the hospital. Subsequently, Duffy had to have 70 pellets removed from his foot, and skin was taken from his hip for a skin graft. Earlier that same night, the assailant had broken into the home of Duffy's pregnant girlfriend, terrifying her while searching for Duffy. The violence of the January 7th attack led to the arrest of 7 individuals, including Thomas Harrison, Leroy Vincent Fisher, Clive Thomas, and Paul James Bryan. Bryan, known to be a psychopath by those familiar with him, was also suspected of multiple murders and deeply involved in the local drug trade. his criminal empire uncovered through police surveillance and wiretaps. On March 31st, 1991, just 2 months after undergoing major surgery for a gunshot wound, Lee Duffy violently attacked bouncer Peter Wilson at Wicker's World, leaving Wilson with a broken neck and a month-long hospital stay. Duffy was remanded in Durham prison on charges of GBH related to the attack. Allegations surfaced that Duffy had offered £2,500 through a third party to persuade Wilson to drop the charges, leading to an additional charge of perverting the course of justice. Duffy faced further charges for assaulting Islam Gull and issuing death threats. For his safety, Duffy was placed in solitary confinement due to the threat of being killed by 18 other inmates, including those involved in his previous shooting incidents. Bizarrely, Lee was granted bail and was free to roam Middlesbrough once more. The attempts on his life persisted and seemed relentless, with the third taking place at the Commercial Public House, one of Duffy's local hangouts. In another violent encounter, David Tapping, in a moment of madness, doused Duffy in petrol, seemingly ready to set him ablaze. Instinctively, Duffy ran outside, stripping off his clothes to avoid being engulfed in flames. Fueled by adrenaline and sheer fury, he stormed back into the pub and unleashed a brutal assault on Tapping, delivering a series of blows that left him with a broken jaw and a battered face. According to witness reports, Duffy was heard singing "Come On Baby Light My Fire" by Jim Morrison, after he'd beat Tapping within an inch of his life. Despite being the victim of the petrol attack, Lee Duffy found himself under police scrutiny after Tapping accused him of initiating the violence. He was arrested and bailed again, but no conviction followed from the altercation, as his reign of terror would inevitably end with a grim outcome. The incident was yet another chapter in his increasingly volatile life, where every confrontation threatened to be his last. One of the most intense rivalries of Duffy's life was with another local hardman, David Allison. Unlike most, Allison was one of the few who never backed down in Duffy's presence. Their tensions simmered for months, and their clashes became the stuff of legend. Their first significant altercation took place outside the magistrates on Grangetown Road. Known for his ferocity, Duffy left Allison battered and bruised, but that encounter only fueled the growing animosity between them. Their rivalry escalated with each encounter, and in their second fight, Allison briefly gained the upper hand, only for the fight to be broken up before a clear winner could emerge. The hostility between the two was palpable, with heated verbal exchanges, and even a gunshot fired by Duffy in an attempt to intimidate Allison during one confrontation in Newcastle. The tension was ever present, reaching a boiling point at a mutual friend's wedding. In a rare moment of restraint, Duffy, out of respect for his friend, called on another to take him home before he did something that would ruin the wedding. Yet the tension between the two powerhouses remained unresolved, a powder keg ready to ignite at the slightest spark into another violent clash. On August 25, 1991, a blues party at the Afro-Caribbean Center marked the final chapter of Lee Duffy's life. Despite his commanding presence, he faced David Allison again, a fierce rival who remained unshaken by Duffy's reputation. Rumors suggested their altercation was over missing drugs, but the deeper issue was Allison's refusal to fear Duffy, a challenge Lee could never accept. As the night wore on, words were exchanged, and the atmosphere inside the party boiled over into the car park, drawing a crowd eager to witness the showdown. Under the harsh streetlights, Duffy, bare-chested and full of rage, seemed to have the upper hand. He overpowered Allison, slamming his head into the concrete as the crowd watched, some in horror, others in fascination. But in a harsh twist of fate, the fight took a deadly turn. Allison, handed a knife by an ally in the crowd, struck Duffy beneath the arm. The realization that he had been stabbed hit Lee hard, and he desperately searched for a way out of the fight. He tried to flee but collapsed, his body giving in to the substantial blood loss. A passerby, noticing Duffy's condition, helped him into their car and rushed him to the hospital. Lee had been stabbed at 3:20 a.m., and despite the quick response, doctors battled unsuccessfully to stop the bleeding. Lee Duffy was pronounced dead at 3:55 a.m., at just 26 years old. The news of his death spread quickly. One of Teesside's most feared men had lost his life. Initially, many believed that the identity of his killer would remain a well-kept secret, with no witnesses willing to come forward. However, the burden of guilt proved too much for David Allison. He confessed to his father before surrendering to the police, and shortly after, he was charged with the murder. David Allison's trial was set for February 1993, But as the date approached, the community was still reeling from the aftermath of Lee Duffy's death. His funeral, held on September 3, 1991, had drawn thousands who lined the streets to pay their respects. A somber silence filled the air that crisp autumn morning, as the crowd, made up of friends, rivals, and the curious, gathered to witness the final chapter in Duffy's storied life. The funeral was a spectacle befitting the larger-than-life figure Duffy had been. 2 lorries were required just to carry the overwhelming number of floral tributes, with displays in the shape of a boxing ring, gloves, and heartfelt messages like "Dad, the Duffer," and "Number 1." Mourners whispered in hushed tones, their voices tinged with a mixture of respect, grief, and unease, as they gathered to say goodbye to a man who had cast a long shadow over the Northeast for years. At the cemetery, the air crackled with an uneasy tension, a mixture of grief and an unshakable sense that something ominous lingered just out of sight. Some had come to pay their respects, leaving flowers and messages scribbled on scraps of paper. Others were driven by morbid curiosity, seeking a glimpse into the life and death of the man who had become an urban legend. This was not just the end of a man's life. It marked the end of an era in Middlesbrough's underworld. His death divided the town. Some saw him as a benefactor who supported local businesses and protected bar owners, valuing his loyalty and support. Others viewed him as a symbol of corruption and fear, seeing his demise as a chance to cleanse the town of his violent legacy. But with Duffy gone, the balance of power in Middlesbrough's underworld shifted dramatically. For years, his formidable presence had kept potential challengers at bay. Now, the vultures began to circle, as younger, more ambitious criminals saw his death as an opportunity to rise. They eagerly moved to claim pieces of the empire Duffy had left behind. Rumors circulated about plans to desecrate his grave, prompting police to provide temporary protection. Despite their efforts, the grave was vandalized with graffiti and black paint, shocking the town. The act, whether by rivals or those seeking revenge, was a symbolic challenge to Duffy's legacy and power. The trial of David Allison in February 1993 at Teesside Crown Court would highlight the deep complexities of self-defense, fear, and retribution. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Allison recounted the night of the fatal altercation, claiming he acted in self-defense, knowing Duffy's violent reputation and his tendency to carry a gun. His defense lawyer painted a picture of Lee Duffy not as a victim, but as a notorious bully whose penchant for violence and dangerous games, such as playing Russian roulette with a loaded revolver, instilled fear in everyone who crossed his path. The defense argued that Allison, faced with an immediate threat, had no choice but to defend himself when Duffy initiated the fight that ended in his death. As the trial progressed, emotions ran high. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty of murder, not guilty of manslaughter. The courtroom erupted in cheers as Allison smiled, finally freed from the weight of his charges. But while relief washed over Allison and his supporters, Duffy's family felt the sting of unresolved grief. Duffy's mother, in disbelief, remarked, "It's not a true verdict." Yet, in a poignant moment, she acknowledged that her son wouldn't have wanted Allison to go to prison. Lee wasn't the kind of man who wanted others to go to jail. Later that year, another prominent figure, Viv Graham, met a violent end, shot and killed. With key figures either dead or imprisoned, the community reeled from the waves of violence that defined those years. Charges against others previously arrested for attempts on Duffy's life were dropped, with only one, Rich Neal, facing an 18-month sentence for perverting the course of justice. The trial of David Allison for the death of Lee Duffy profoundly impacted the community, sparking debates about justice, self-defense, and the influence of one's past. Duffy's name lingered, with his story becoming a blend of fact and folklore. Even in death, Lee Duffy's influence remained a significant and lasting presence in the northeast of England and beyond. Lee Duffy's friends have said that his motto was to live by the sword and die by the sword. Well, he certainly lived up to that mantra. His life was a testament to his own creed, marked by violence and defiance. His story serves as a stark reminder of the high cost of living a life of fear and power. In the end, Duffy's legacy remains a complex mix of respect and revulsion, embodying the fierce and unforgiving world he inhabited. Thanks for watching. If you found this story intriguing and want to see more content like this, Don't forget to like and subscribe to Dark Sleuth Secrets for more tales from the criminal underworld. And hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our uploads. Share your thoughts on Lee Duffy in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep sleuthing.